And speech.
Getting the Nobel Prize.
I want to meet Rev JERRY FALWELL in Lynchburg, Virginia, in a face-to-face debate.
Very well. What they wanted, a forum in which they could debate at greater length the subject of South Africa. Good evening, I'm Ted+Koppel, and this is a special edition of Nightline. Tonight, we'll give Mr. Falwell and Mr. Jackson the forum they wanted.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted+Koppel.
Just to avoid any confusion or misunderstanding, let me quickly run through the ground rules. About 10 days ago, I had preliminary conversations with both the Rev Jackson and the Rev Falwell. We agreed, and each confirmed to me in a written statement that this would be a one-hour Nightline program, not a formal debate. No one will be keeping time, although I will try, as I do on other nights, to make sure that each guest has a fair and roughly equivalent opportunity to make his position clear. Each of our guests has assured me that he is here to discuss the issue of South Africa, not to launch personal attacks on the other. I'll make every effort to see that those assurances are met. We have prepared, in the event that the discussion gets hung up on a term or issue that may not be familiar to most members of our audience, some very short video packages in which those terms or issues are defined. Where appropriate, we may drop one of those packages in. Our subject tonight is South Africa. And gentlemen, let me begin by asking you, Mr. Jackson, what is the issue? Just 5 days from now, the U.S. Senate will be voting on sanctions against South Africa. What's the issue that they're voting on here?
The Congress of the United States, the House and Senate, have now recommended to conference a sanctions bill to put on the desk of President Reagan. We hope that he will sign that sanctions bill and not veto it, because it becomes the way of taking the profit out of apartheid and thereby forcing the relevant forces, legitimate leadership in South Africa, black and white, to the table to talk it out and stop fighting it out.
I didn't frame my question, I guess, precisely enough. What I'm really asking is, to the millions of people who are watching tonight who perhaps have not been paying that much attention to South Africa, why, to the American voter, is this important? What is the issue at stake?
South Africa is a government that, on the basis of race, suppresses the majority of its citizens on the basis of race for the purpose of economic exploitation. It's a system called apartheid, people set aside by race, where 87% of the people live on 13% of the land, and they're denied basic self-expression, basically the right to vote, the right of mobility, called influx laws. They walk around with passbooks, and as a result of their rebellion against that oppressive system, of course, they have been put down now violently.
So the issue is what?
The issue is that apartheid, as a state of terror, must end, and America's obligation to be a part of it, inasmuch as we're South Africa's #1 investor and trading partner. We are, in fact, in partnership with the apartheid government.
All right, Mr. Falwell, same question. What is the issue? Because you see it a little differently, don't you?
Well, certainly I see apartheid as an abominable practice that must go, and in fairness to the Botha government, they have committed, and I will read to you a statement from that government given last Saturday, which no press covered, apparently, in which they have repudiated apartheid themselves. But that is not the overriding issue. The overriding issue in South Africa is that while apartheid must be cut out, we have a national security problem for the United States. South Africa, like Zimbabwe, like Mozambique, like Angola, like Ethiopia, so many African states, it is the plum on the continent that the Soviet Union wants, and through its surrogate, the African National Congress, and its arm in South Africa, the United Democratic Front, everyone inside that country knows these are the catalysts who are creating that state of emergency, the bloodshed, the violence of black against blacks, that bring in what we see on 6 o'clock television every night, the police coming in a very difficult situation, either to stand back and let the carnage continue, or come in and be accused of brutality. Yes, they make a lot of terrible mistakes, but I'm saying that we can cut that cancer of apartheid out without killing the patient and making the same mistake that we have made repeatedly. You know, Henry Kissinger said, Ted, that to be our enemy is hazardous. To be a friend of the United States is fatal. And when you look at what we did in the situation of the Shah for the Ayatollah, when you look at Batista for Castro, when you look at Somoza for Ortega, you know, sometimes we must deal with a skunk occasionally who is our friend, but I'd much prefer dealing with one who's spraying in the other direction, and we have a propensity for stepping on our friends.
Let me just for 1 second abbreviate what each of you has said, and let's see if I can get you to pick up on it. You see it as a moral issue, you see it as a geopolitical issue. Anti-communism for you, an ethical question for you. How do we ever...
Well, I would say also it's an ethical and a moral question,
I think,
too.
Ted, that you said that one guideline would primarily focus on South Africa and what America will do about South Africa and its relationship to South Africa and its implications for the world. Communist red baiting is really diversionary. The African National Congress was founded in 1912, 5 years before the Russian Revolution, 12 years before the Soviet Union was organized. Blacks in South Africa did not need to be communist-inspired to want the right of self-expression and the right to vote. And for 50 years, various legal methods and various nonviolent actions failed, and that organization took a rather different turn and became more combative, at which time 160 of its leaders were tried for treason, some are jailed, and others, of course, have been put into exile. Basically, the issue is how shall we end apartheid? It is immoral theologically, it is psychologically damaging, and politically it is on a disastrous timetable. We really have three options. One, to wait for Botha. But the history of pharaohs and Nebuchadnezzar's retiring or getting tired of being exploitative is not a very great one. The second option, of course, is violent confrontation. It's undesirable, it's unfeasible, too many people will die. The third one is to take the profit out of apartheid, and that's how you remove the cancer and preserve the industrial society. Apartheid right now is the enemy to democracy, and in some sense becomes the stimulus for another ideology.
And I would say amen to everything that Jesse just said, except this. Red baiting is just a cop-out. That's like the New York Times saying Castro is not a communist, which they did say, and we all remember that. That is like saying the Sandinistas are freedom fighters. We know after they've killed thousands of Mosquito Indians, they're worse than that. The ANC, Oliver Tambo, if he were sitting here, would tell you, receives much of its funding from Moscow. They don't hide that. And the UDF, we went into the country of South Africa, our second trip there, going back again next month. And we talked to people out there, and Jesse cannot name, in my opinion, one elected black, colored, or Indian who is for disinvestment, for sanctions. And the fact is, I had breakfast yesterday morning with a minister. His name is Bishop Lekanyani, who heads up 4.5 million members of the Zion Christian Church. He flew to Washington to meet with some people from the White House, which he did do. I met with him, I had breakfast with him, and he said to me that for the 4.5 members of our church, and by the way, he had P.W. Botha, the president, to speak to them on Easter Sunday. 3 million were present in one place. Quite a sight. He said disinvestment and sanctions will starve our people, will destroy our people, create unemployment, create all kinds of unrest. And like many of the members of the council, of the city council of Soweto, who are elected by their own people, the chief Buthelezi of the 6.5 million Zulu tribe, and like right now, a bishop who flies in tomorrow, Bishop Mokoeno, who heads up 4.5 million Anglicans, Bishop Tutu, 1.5 million. This bishop with 4.5 million Anglicans is coming here to beg for no disinvestment, no sanctions. We want apartheid out. That's a cancer.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I want you to respond to the point that's been made now on disinvestment and the support, or opposition rather, to disinvestment from black South Africans and your views on that. We'll be back with more of this discussion in just a moment.
This special edition of ABC News Nightline is brought to you by...
Invest and disinvest are virtually interchangeable terms. The point of both is for U.S. firms, investors, and consumers to cut commercial ties with South Africa. That policy would force the 300 U.S. firms with South African operations to withdraw, ending some $2.3 billion worth of investments. Altogether, divestiture or disinvestment could affect some $15 billion in U.S. business with or in South Africa.
Back once again live with the Reverend Jerry Falwell and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Mr. Jackson, you've heard the argument. many blacks are afraid of divestment or afraid of disinvestment because they are the ones who will be hurt. To which you say what?
Well, with increased investment in apartheid, the rope around the necks of the people appears to be getting tighter as opposed to looser. Secondly, with the American corporations that are there, they're providing about 70,000 jobs, about 1%. There are about 22 million blacks there. And so 70,000 jobs is not a trade-off for the dignity of 22 million people. After all, in slavery, everybody had a job, but nobody had dignity, the right to vote, or the right of self-determination. So if, in fact, people get the right to vote, they will also get a job. Secondly, this investment has been successful. There is now a flight of capital, so much so that now the American money is under house arrest in South Africa. They cannot withdraw their money, not going to get paid on the principal for it. And that has forced the economic forces in South Africa to say to the political forces, there must be a change because in this climate, we cannot go on. And that is a rather bloodless change to the apartheid system as opposed to military confrontation.
No question about it, Mr. Falwell. It is putting the squeeze on. The South African government is hurting as never before.
But that also is not the issue, because if, in fact, we divest, it is not only the 300 American plants that are there, but literally hundreds of millions of dollars in all the other South African-owned industries. And the fact is there are 1.5 million blacks in South Africa now who've come there from surrounding countries, Lesotho, Swaziland, Mozambique, from all the surrounding countries. Nobody leaves South Africa to go to other countries. They come into South Africa, and they work there, and each of them is supporting 6 persons back in his homeland, meaning to divest could actually put 10 to 12 million blacks, not only in South Africa, but outside in the surrounding black nations in hunger and starvation. And a worse issue is this, and this is where the black leadership in South Africa is so frustrated. They go to the South African Council of Churches always to get an opinion on what are South Africans thinking. Nobody goes to Bishop Mokoena with 4.5 million black Africans in his church, or to Bishop Lekanyani with 4.5 million in his independent Zion Christian Church, or to Buthelezi, the chief, with 6.5 million in the Zulu tribe. Nobody ever mentions that what these people are saying, that you will starve our people, our families will hunger. 1.5 million people live in Soweto. All we see is the war that's going on there. The fact is that the city council, from the mayor right through, spoke to us for over 2 hours and in unison said, you are not going to hurt the government, you're going to hurt us. Now,
what do you say to that point?
The investment in South Africa has not allowed due process to become a fact. It has not stopped a Reverend Alan Bozak from being arrested without charge, unable to see his wife, unable to see a lawyer. The investment there has not stopped the arrest of children 6, 8, 10, and 12 years of age. The investment there has not stopped 500,000 people from being arrested last year for influx laws because they want to move from one place to another. So the fact is, the investment there, it is for the profit of the investor, not for the humanity of those who live there.
Ted,
let me turn it around for a moment, Mr. Jackson. For the last several months, there has been more pressure from the United States and from other governments around the world on the South African government than ever before. As we all mentioned a moment ago, the South African government is hurting. Why can it not be argued that that pressure is not having any effect either? If anything, the government is becoming more repressive now.
The pressure is having an effect. And what we see now, if you had a boil on your arm, there would become a point where it would swell and become intense in its pain. Perhaps you would think you were dying. But that would not mean that you were dying, but rather the blood is purifying. Change is not painless. And what we see now, when South Africa panics and has to arrest leaders and has to arrest the American money and therefore has to stop a flight of capital, it means it is working. And if in fact President Reagan makes the move to sign that bill, and other Western democratic allies who themselves are victims of fascism just 40 years ago chooses ethics over economics and will engage in short-term pain for long-term pleasure, that is the most viable way out.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to take another break. When we come back, I want to pick up on the issue of constructive engagement, the U.S. policy towards South Africa at this time. We'll be back in just a moment.
More than 650 blacks have died in the last 18 months in politically related violence. More than 170 of those deaths have occurred since the state of emergency was imposed. Several blacks suspected of collaborating with the government have been killed by other blacks, but most have died at the hands of police. And recently, 4 whites have been killed by blacks in unprovoked attacks.
And we are back live again with the Reverend Jerry Falwell and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Mr. Falwell, the Reagan administration's policy towards South Africa is shorthanded as one of constructive engagement. Give me the pros, then, Mr. Jackson, if you'll give me the con.
Well, President Reagan believes, and I think very properly so, that the best way to deal with South Africa is in a gradual and coercive effort that brings about the elimination of apartheid without creating, number one, violence and bloodshed in the land, and number two, without giving the Marxists a toehold in the country, which, of course, as we all know, we've seen by example, they thrive upon unrest and those kinds of problems. The South African issue has to be the Watergate of the American media. There's no question about it. For example, on that continent, you have to go down to about 20 or 30 to find South Africa as the major problem. Major problem is Ethiopia. Right now, we're trying with our own ministry to feed dying, starving Ethiopians, Sudanese. They blow our trucks up if we try to get up into the northern region where they, in a genocidal act, are killing 7 million of their own people. Second in that dubious list of distinction would be Uganda, where since Idi Amin, they have killed 300,000 blacks. You come down to, Libya, and the exportation of Gaddafi's hit squads and terrorism and invading Chad. You come way down to...
Bring us back to constructive engagement.
I'll come right back down. Zimbabwe killed 7,000, Mugabe, the Marxist dictator, last year in 6 months. And constructive engagement is simply saying that while we realize 650 is a terrible toll of dead in South Africa, half at the hands of the police, it is most hypocritical to be pointing the spotlight, pointing the gun where they have a free press. You couldn't see all that's happening there, except they allow free press. We don't see these happenings in Havana and in Moscow because you can't bring a camera in there. South Africa is wrong, but constructive engagement says we can, I repeat, cut out the cancer without killing the patient.
It's interesting. You keep dropping Marxism, communism, kind of running back.
Well, it's over there, Jesse.
But let us not forget, Reverend Falwell, that Hitler was not a communist or Marxist, but he was a fascist.
But Castro was, and you said long live Castro.
And Mussolini was not a communist, but he was a fascist. And Pharaoh and Herod were not communists, but they were fascists. A ruling elite of business and military and political leaders who think they have some divine inspiration to determine the destiny of the majority of the people. The fact is, apartheid, not only is it ungodly and immoral, but it is also anti-democratic and anti-free enterprise.
Just like it was here 180 years.
The majority of its citizens do not have the right to engage in free enterprise. The majority of its citizens do not have the right to vote. That is undemocratic. The majority of its citizens are oppressed because of their race, which is ungodly.
Do me a favor. Hold on just 1 second, Mr. Jackson, because I have 2 things. One, don't start reading anything.
I'm not going to read anything. This is something from, this was something the press didn't report. I'd like to let you read it then.
Time. Take your glasses off if you would.
Well, this is a statement by President Falwell
on
your subject.
And the reason he has to get some notes because he doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's talk that like 2 men who know what he's talking about. Now let me ask you a question. Constructive engagement has failed morally because it in fact has encouraged more investment in apartheid. Number 2, it fails practically because things have gotten worse. Thirdly, it is against our national interest because now American money is frozen into that system. We can't get our money out, and now the rest of the world
is saying if you're worried about getting our money out, how about the $300 million we put in Zimbabwe? You have been trying to get that out. Why haven't you been marching up in front of the embassies other than South Africa, like the Soviet embassy, like the Red Chinese embassy, the Soviet Union? The Soviet
we're
Union.
Discussing
South Africa. I'm telling you about your hypocrisy, though, Jesse. I'm telling you.
Gentlemen, let me tell you both. The first thing that you're not going to do, I hope, and I do want you to engage in this kind of colloquy by all means, but let's not start the name calling. We all agreed that wasn't going to happen.
Okay.
Mr. Jackson, pick up on one point, and it's not evading the issue of South Africa, but it is a legitimate point. where in other African nations tens of thousands of people in some instances are being killed. Draw a moral equivalent for me, if you will, between that, between an Ethiopia, for example, between a Uganda, for example. Draw a moral equivalent for me. Explain to Mr. Falwell,
For example,
why it is that you raise South Africa in terms of...
I want to get the answer to that.
Well, first of all, you look at Zimbabwe, which went through a tremendous revolution after many years of colonialism, and it has its own post-colonial problems. Amnesty International, which is a far more credible source and an ad hoc source, cannot find the 7,000 that have been killed. But they do know now that for the first time since that revolution, whites are now leaving South Africa, going back to Zimbabwe, as opposed to leaving Zimbabwe, going to South Africa. Our own country, after a post-colonial struggle with Britain, had a civil war. We lost more Americans in the civil war between North and South than we lost in the Second World War. So nations emerging out of chaos, moving towards some kind of order, is a rather natural thing.
But why have you not protested against Ethiopia's genocidal action against 7 million of its own black people?
Number one, the religious tradition in Ethiopia is so strong and so old. The oldest on the continent. Communism is not taking, in fact. And for 3 years after we knew of the genocidal policies there, our government refused to help feed starving people, hanging behind ideology, talking about Marxism. And it was not until the British television company exposed it, and just the people themselves overwhelmed our government and began to feed the hungry.
Government right now, Jesse, blows up the trucks of Christian ministries and care organizations, does not allow us to take food to their own people. We mentioned the Soviet Union. In 69 months now of genocide against Afghanistan. Nobody's trying to help Afghanistan.
Okay, we are drifting a little bit away from South Africa now.
Because we are getting into the hypocrisy of this whole anti-South Africa lobby.
But we are going to come back to the issue of South Africa when we return, which we will do in just a moment.
The anti-apartheid movement in the U.S. launched its present campaign last November, when its leaders were arrested for staging a sit-in at the South African embassy. Since then, daily demonstrations from Monday through Friday have produced 2,665 arrests, including 1 U.S. senator, 19 members of Congress, and a former president's daughter.
Thursday on 2020.
And we are back live once again in Washington with the Reverend Jerry Falwell and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Mr. Falwell, explain to me, what is Jerry Falwell's interest? What is the interest of the moral majority, if indeed there is any, in South Africa? Why these current visits?
Because for 30 years I have watched that blood-red river of communism, and that's not red baiting, it's a reality that 40% of the earth today is under the hammer and the sickle. Take nation after nation after nation. We've watched almost the same procedure occur in every place, the unrest, the violence, and so forth. South Africa, unlike any of the other countries, probably is the most strategically important to the West. Not only do we have a deep concern for the 30 million people who live there, and there is no monolithic majority, by the way, and I hope we get into the breakdown of the population in a moment to show it is not a black-white issue, but a red and blue, communism versus freedom issue. But if South Africa falls, number one, the minerals that we need for most of the basic defense items in this country, not to speak of building refrigerators, we'll buy from the Soviet Union. The sea lanes are the busiest in the world around the Cape of Good Hope. 90% of all of Western Europe's oil comes that way. NATO, of course, will be then at the mercy of the Soviet Union. I'm thinking what Pik Botha said, the foreign minister, recently, is a true fact, and that is that if we allow this, if we continue a part of this international hypocrisy, picking South Africa for our whipping boy, and bring her down, we will have dug our own grave.
Mr. Jackson.
My first concern about South Africa is that the state of apartheid, it is immoral, it is ungodly. Unless the Lord builds a house, they labor, but they labor in vain. It does not have a moral foundation. Secondly, it is racist in its treatment of non-white people. Thirdly, it is fascist. That is, it is controlled by a relatively small group of politicians, militarists, and business people. Fourthly, it undercuts American labor. We got copper miners in in Arizona trying to make $9 an hour, undercut by copper miners making slave labor in South Africa, making less than $1 an hour. We've got coal miners in Alabama losing their job to coal miners in South Africa who cannot strike without violence of their leaders being arrested. We got steel workers in Indiana and Illinois and Ohio losing their job to steel workers there. So it undercuts organized labor. Besides, South Africa now has nuclear capability. And given the mindset in that country that will lock up ministers without charge and jail and tear gas children, that much power is too much to be held in the hand of ungodly people.
All right, but what happens when you look at the world through, forgive me, but rather cold, realistic eyes, and you say there are an awful lot of governments around the world that do the kinds of things you've been describing, and there are a lot of governments around the world that are undercutting American labor. Some of them are our best friends. What do you say to those like Mr. Falwell, who has just said, we, the United States, desperately need what this country has in terms of strategic reserves, in terms of strategic location, in terms of being an important foothold for the West against communism?
We need it, but the price that we pay for it cannot be to embrace fascism. We needed Iran, but by embracing a dictator and not giving political democracy an alternative, we end up with the other extreme, the Ayatollah. The extremes in South Africa is not that we hold on to apartheid and slavery just to keep some minerals or run to communism, but we in fact fight for the meeting of legitimate leaders, black and white, who are popular in their support base. Two, that we fight for a state in which people have the right of self-expression, the right to vote, the right to engage in free enterprise, the right to own land. And I tell you, Ted, people who live from the fruits of democracy don't want communism. Dictators don't like democracy because too many people make decisions. The people who are hungry has no allegiance to any system. And therefore you fight communism, in fact, far more with food and education and civilized behavior than you do with a stick and a whip and a gun and a jail.
Let me ask you both something. Have we reached the point of almost no return in South Africa?
I don't think
Are we
so at
reaching
all.
a critical flashpoint here?
I think we are at a very important time. But the Botha government on Saturday, meeting with 3 representatives of the European Economic Community, representing 10 European nations, who were coming there with the idea that we are going to go back and recommend sanctions, rather heard from Mr. Botha and received a press release, a statement saying some very radical things that have to do with the abolition and repudiation of apartheid. And in spite of the fact that Mr. Jackson doesn't think I know what's on the sheet of paper, I can quote it for you. The elimination of the past system, the total political rights of all 30 million citizens, and reading what Paul Johnson, a British historian, said last week, that if at the present rate of reform, and P.W. Botha is a reformer. We heard that from the blacks, the coloreds, the Indians, everybody that the anti-South Africa lobby never goes to, including the American media. We heard what Paul Johnson said, that in 5 years, apartheid will be history at the present rate of reform. Now, the question we're asking is this.
We're almost out of time in this segment.
All right.
And the fact is, Botha had a world platform to state that to the world and fell on his face.
But he said it last Saturday,
He embarrassed
Jesse.
the Reagan administration. He undercut the position that McFarlane represented. And even now the White House says Mandela must be a part of talks to make them legitimate, because what we need now is a sitting around the table, choosing negotiation over confrontation, and Botha does not have the power, either morally or divinely, to determine the timetable of other people's freedom. He's moving much too slow for reality.
Well, one thing is for sure,
we got to take a break.
Communism is an equal opportunity oppressor, and no change ever occurs there. We're far better off with Botha.
We'll continue this debate in just a moment. We'll be back.
The United States is South Africa's #1 trading partner and 3rd largest investor. America relies on South Africa for several of its strategic metals, including 66% of its platinum, 61% of its cobalt, and 55% of its chromium.
They say
The leader of black South Africans is a man most of them have never seen, heard, or even read about. Since Nelson Mandela was jailed 23 years ago for plotting revolution and sabotage, authorities have tried to blot him from public consciousness, making it a crime to publish his words or even print his photo in a newspaper.
Once again with the Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Reverend Jerry Falwell. Mr. Falwell, Nelson Mandela, he has become a cause celeb even here in the United States. He's long been a cause celeb in South Africa. Your opinion? Do you think he ought to be let go?
People have forgotten, because the press has helped them to forget, that 23 years ago he went to prison as a self-confessed terrorist. He had enough hand grenades and explosives to blow Johannesburg off the map. 2 weeks ago when I was there, 2 journalists who traveled with me from the LA Times and the Washington Times, by permission of Mr. Botha, the president, went down to visit him in the prison, and perchance someone had maybe thought he'd had a Christian conversion, which I believe he could have, but some had been talking that he was a changed person. Ask him, among other questions, a final question, if you could get out of here today, what would you do? He said in jest, I will be back, in essence, I'll be back here in 24 hours because I'll do the same thing again. How can the government that has often said, we will let you out if you'll renounce violence, repudiate violence, we will release you? What more can the government do?
Mr. Jackson.
In the face of hundreds of thousands of people arrested, in the face of innocent children shot down and massacred in Sharpsville, in the face of increased violence, he said he will not renounce violence until the government renounces violence. The fact is, both ought to renounce violence and break that cycle and get to the table and end the war of rhetoric. The fact is, Mandela is a force to be reckoned with. And I might add, not only is Mandela a force to be reckoned with for what he represents to the people, that is, their right to vote and their right to self-expression, but also people like Bishop Desmond Tutu and Archbishop Hurley and Bishop Peter Story ought to have been persons that Reverend Falwell met with when he went there. For there is a body of thought there, indigenous leadership, who embrace essentially the spirit of Mandela, and it is the most live alternative to continued bloodshed.
And every one of the ministers you just mentioned, Ted, that Jesse just mentioned, are members of the South African Council of Churches, who, according to many we talked with out there, in the black, colored, and Indian communities, are furnishing much of the funding for the violence that's going on. Now, the ANC, for example.
You're talking about the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize.
No. I'm talking about Bullseye. I am not accusing Tutu of being involved in what the World Council of Churches may be doing through that organization. And CBS 60 Minutes exposed that a year ago, as you know. Now, all I'm saying is that out in the hustings, these people are saying, come and talk to us. We need help. The ANC is now doing broadcast, and we have the scripts, the broadcast, and I'm not allowed to read anything here, but they're doing broadcasts, which we do have the scripts of, into the people saying, bomb, kill, burn, challenging the people to do all the things that Mandela stands for, that Oliver Tambo stands for, and they get the encouragement from this side of the water, from Trans-Africa, Randall Robinson, Ron Dellums, and John Conyers, and these fellows, and it's a disgrace before God. And we as ministers of the gospel who believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ for all men, Jesse, and who believe in salvation by grace that leads people to peaceful solutions, should not be encouraging the Mandelas of this world towards violence.
Reverend Falwell,
while we condemn apartheid, we should not support the Mandelas.
You suggested, without any first-hand knowledge of the man, and you had a chance, that Dr. King, a PhD, Nobel Peace Prize winner,
go back 25 years
and theologian, was inspired by communism.
No, I never said that. I beg your pardon. Now, I want you to support that statement. Wait a minute, you're making reckless statements, Jesse. And if you want to go back 25 years ago, I can take you to Yasser Arafat.
I'll tell you what, Mr. Falwell, give Mr. Jackson a chance to finish.
I want to respond.
You suggested that the civil rights leadership, the kings and the farmers, the communists inspired. That's well documented.
Well, now, you've got to document that. Don't just say it's well documented.
You further suggested that Bishop Tutu, the Bishop of Johannesburg, white and black parishioners, was somehow inauthentic and never gave yourself a chance to meet the man. Indeed, as I went to your church and met with you as a man,
and I went to yours the night before, did I not?
And secondly, and I took the initiative to do that because
I was coming and you reluctantly gave in.
It was the Christian and the responsible thing to do. You suggest that Archbishop Hurley, the Catholic Archbishop of that country.
I've never heard his name right now.
Well, you should have.
Well, you're just suggesting things.
You talk too long and you stayed too short. That's the problem.
Let me tell you, Jesse, what your problem is.
May I finish my point?
Please.
Reverend Peter Story, Methodist bishop. These are authentic leaders. The World Council of Churches is an authentic church organization that has wrestled with live alternatives and to somehow suggest that organization either communist-inspired or terroristic in its nature is unfair. And to go there and not talk with that body of Christian leaders and at least hear their point of view and talk with both is in effect like talking with Herod and ignoring Jesus and the wise men.
Let me respond then, sir.
It's really the wrong side of history.
If you would do it briefly, please.
My response is this. We begged for 3 times a meeting with Bishop Tutu. He didn't even respond. We asked for meetings with that branch of the church. They wouldn't hear us. And when you talk about 25 years ago, when the South, where I grew up, was segregationist, long since, and I've said this in the presence of Rev Jackson last weekend, the Lord delivered me from that. And I don't think that I am any more anti-civil rights today than he is anti-white today. When he spit in a salad, he said himself, and passed it out through a restaurant door to a white family each time and watched them eat it like thinking it was Italian dressing. I think he's asked God's forgiveness for that, and I don't believe he's any more a racist as he was. I certainly am not, and I'm saying to you that embracing Arafat over the Jews and Assad over Jamal and sending his wife down to embrace the Sandinistas over the Mesquite Indians, and himself standing with Fidel Castro last year and saying, "Long live Fidel Castro and Che Guevara," that someone might question his foreign policy judgment.
Gentlemen, I'm beginning to believe that we're slipping away a little from our mutual assurance here that we weren't going to engage.
And I'm not going to go to that level. Because
well, you did, and I just finished it.
I think it does not serve the interest.
I agree with you. And what
you shouldn't have brought it up.
Gentlemen, we're going to take
American people must
it's
make
time
a
for a commercial break,
in about a week on South Africa, and that's the real
Take the
issue.
offering.
There is something called a commercial imperative, and we've just reached it. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment.
Corned beef with mustard.
Live again in Washington with Jesse Jackson and Jerry Falwell. Gentlemen, I want to come back to where we began.
That raised the point. I think it's unfortunate. A man like Randall Robinson, Virginia Union University graduate, Harvard lawyer, through Trans-Africa, has done a tremendous job bringing to this nation a higher level of consciousness through nonviolent direct action. The likes of Conyers and Dillams, within the context of the U.S. Congress, has been able to convince Congress people and senators alike that America has several options there. One option is to stand back and do nothing and wait on Volta's timetable. It's too slow for reality. The other was to reinvest in a system that is now economically collapsing. Look at the value of the rand, look at the flight of capital, look at the frozen money. The third option would be some kind of violent confrontation. They've ruled that out. The fourth one is to, in fact, use economic sanctions in order to get the attention of that government. That's where you take the cancer out, on the one hand, of apartheid and preserve the industrial democracy, which is appealing.
All right. You have brought me back to the point I wanted to make. That is the politics of it right now. The U.S. Senate is going to vote in 5 days. The president's going to have to make a decision whether or not he's going to pass that bill or veto it. What do you think is going to happen and why?
There's no question that the Senate overwhelmingly is going to vote for sanctions, because the media has framed the issue that if you are opposed to sanctions, you are a racist. That's as ridiculous as us saying that everyone who is for sanctions is a communist. I mean, the conservatives on that side. But there are many who are voting politics on this rather than national security, and that's almost inexcusable. In my opinion, I don't know this, the president, in my opinion, will veto, at which time, in 10 days later, when there's another vote, I think that he will be able to muster the 34 votes he needs in the United States Senate to kill sanctions and prevent that domino effect that through sanctions will cause in Europe, as Jesse said earlier, a progressive, debilitating and hypocritical beating upon South Africa. I just repeat what Henry Kissinger said. It's fatal to be our friend.
First of all, as ministers, if it's immoral and ungodly, that ought to be enough for us to take aggressive action.
If you're willing to do it with the Soviet Union, Jesse, I'll stand with you. But as long as you're playing the hypocrite, I won't.
It is economically unfeasible. Our money is frozen. To want to buy more Kruger rands for South Africa now, at the time when we can't get our money out, we need to know The Krugerrands cannot save the South African economy.
The Lord Jesus Christ can, but may I say to you...
I'm asking you, just 1 second, please. I'm asking you, though, what your political assessment is. You buy the same timetable that Jerry Falwell just enunciated?
I don't understand.
The timetable. In other words, that the Senate is going to vote sanctions, the President is going to veto those sanctions, the Senate is then going to override.
I think the House and the Senate is going...
Or will not override,
the House and Senate is going to vote
sustain
sanctions.
his veto.
Sustain the veto.
There is evidence that Mr. Reagan's embrace of that system and his kinship with Botha is going to incline him to veto it. I hope he does not do that. I hope he makes a higher judgment. For I am convinced if he in fact signs that legislation and then convenes our other Western Democratic allies, he can change the options of South Africa, save it from communism on one extreme, apartheid on the other, and help negotiate for political democracy. The salvation of South Africa is a political democracy. It involves the right of people to vote. It involves meeting with legitimate leaders. It involves opening up free enterprise.
All of which President Botha last
citizens.
Saturday agreed with the EEC, and all that's history. That is no longer the issue. The issue is this. Malcolm Wallop, the senator from Wyoming, suggested, or in fact introduced legislation, an amendment, to require that, yes, we will sanction South Africa. We'll vote sanctions as long as we agree to put sanctions against every other country that's violating human rights, beginning with the Soviet Union.
Doesn't that water it down beyond any point?
That plays fair. That's fairness.
And the fact is...
That exposes the hypocrisy of this position.
The key to dealing with the Soviet Union is the kind of summit the president is going to have. A boycott of that superpower had the effect of starving some Russian hogs.
That's a double standard, double application.
And starving some American farmers. The fact is, we boycott Poland. We have a kind of Cold War against Afghanistan. We must use our judgment case by case. In this instance, this apartheid system is bringing down the moral credibility of our nation. And Jerry, Reverend Falwell, you can't be against it and for it, because if you...
Yes, you can be against it, but you can also be for the blacks out there.
You are down to your last minute. Each of you is going to get... Now we are going to time it. 30 seconds. Sum it up.
Go ahead if you want.
Shoot your best shot.
30, they are in that country, 20 million blacks. 10 tribes, Zulus being the largest, 6.5 million. And the chief Budelese are there, and the various chiefs, all against disinvestment, everyone unanimously against sanctions. The leaders of the largest churches in the country, millions of them, against disinvestment. The Soweto Town Council, we wound up our meeting with a prayer meeting and talking about the Lord Jesus and wonderful singing hymns against disinvestment. South African Church is the only one for it, and Jesse Jackson and Trans-Africa.
And what appears to be consistent is that Dr. Falwell was for Southern apartheid in America.
But I wasn't for Arafat against the Jews.
And he's for Southern apartheid in South Africa. And to say that you are against apartheid but for investment is like being against prostitution but investing in a whorehouse, like being against liquor but investing in a distillery.
I'm not acquainted with that kind of thing. You'll have to explain that to me, Jesse.
It's like being against smoking but investing in a tobacco company.
Never did those things,
You cannot have it. You cannot have it both ways. Botha says every investment in apartheid is another brick. We must tear the brick of apartheid down and fight for a political democracy in South Africa.
I'll join you in a demonstration at the Soviet Embassy tomorrow.
Gentlemen, we are where you were on Good Morning America a few weeks ago. We've run out of time, and you're still talking. I thank both of you very much for being here. I hope you feel you were fairly treated. I'll be back in just a moment.